Good evening. It's April 17th, 2015. My name is Matthew Ogden, and you're joining us for our weekly Friday night webcast here from LaRouchePAC.com. We have a special program scheduled for tonight, which will feature a joint presentation by Benjamin Deniston, a leader of the LaRouchePAC basement team, who's joining me here in the studio tonight. And also, following Ben, we will be joined by Michael Steger, a member of the LaRouchePAC Policy Committee and a former candidate for United States Congress, who's going to be joining us via video from San Francisco, California, where he's on the ground leading our campaign right now in California. Now, the subject of our webcast tonight, which Ben Deniston, who is a relevant expert in this field, will elaborate in detail, will thoroughly discredit the lies that you are being told by Jerry Brown and the likes of him about the so-called water crisis that's happening in the state of California and beyond. Whereas Jerry Brown will insist that the drought is being caused by man-made climate change or overconsumption of a so-called limited water supply, and is mandating killer cuts in water supply to the people of California, cuts which will hit the poorest and the most vulnerable members of the population first, the people who are already barely surviving at all. The fact is, as Mr. LaRouche said earlier today, Jerry Brown and those who agree with him on these matters are incompetent and dangerously so. They have no idea what the scientific principle is which drives the global water cycle, and therefore they have no idea how that water system is to be managed and how new water supplies can be developed and created. The problem is not man-made climate change, but the fact that we haven't changed the climate in the way that we should by mastering and harnessing the physical principles which drive the water cycle as a whole, something which the human species can uniquely do. The fact is, the Earth's water system is not driven primarily by processes here on Earth, but is merely a subordinate feature of a much larger cosmic process on the scale of the solar system and beyond. As Mr. LaRouche was saying to us in our discussion earlier today, if you look at the implications of the work of Johannes Kepler, who discovered that the Earth is not an isolated body floating in empty space, but that our planet is an integral part of a much larger system, the solar system, which is driven by a power that emanates from the sun, which is itself merely an integral part of a much, much larger galactic system, then it's clear that processes here on Earth, including weather systems and the related water cycle, cannot be understood from the standpoint of Earth alone. Anybody who's competent knows that the water system of this planet is controlled by the solar system, not by the Earth. And anyone who tries to deny that fact or is making policy based on a contrary view is dangerously incompetent, because under current conditions, their incompetence will result in the death of a large portion of the population of not only California, but the entire United States. And Mr. LaRouche insisted that it must be said that Jerry Brown is on record as an incompetent idiot when it comes to these matters, whose malicious stupidity has disqualified him for public office and is endangering the lives of the people not only of his state, but of the country as a whole. The fact is, there are very real solutions that are available and can be implemented with the proper leadership. As we've stressed on previous broadcasts here in recent weeks, this program, which has been elaborated by Ben Deniston, must serve as the basis for a new presidency of the United States. So, as I said, my colleague, Ben, has qualified himself as a relevant expert when it comes to these matters, and what he will present to you tonight will thoroughly and irrefutably discredit the lies that you have been told by Jerry Brown. So I'd like to give the podium to Ben.
Thank you, Matthew. Since you left us with reference to the lies of Jerry Brown, I figured I'd start right there with his first lie that he's promoting all over California, all over the country, which is his claim that the water simply isn't there. This is the situation, according to Brown. California's run out of water. The water is not there. It's not available. And Jerry Brown's response to the situation is, well, deal with it. You know, beautiful leadership there. Deal with it. You know, get used to using less. That's the leadership of Jerry Brown. You know, and Michael's gonna get into this in a little bit more. Just the utter insanity, really degeneration represented by this Brown governorship. And the fact that this is life or death for many people in California. And Jerry Brown is committing to a depopulation policy of the state by his policies, by his approach to this so-called water crisis. But this is the first lie. He says the water is not there. Well, the water is there. The water is actually all over the place. It just needs to be managed and developed from the right level. Now, I've got to get into this evening, I've got a number of videos and images to take us through the perspective of this higher level management of the water system that we need to start moving towards, that gives mankind a new ability, you know, not just in California, but globally, to handle the water needs for mankind well into the future. As we've said repeatedly, water is not a finite resource. If somebody thinks water is a finite resource, they need to get their head examined. There is an immense amount of water, and we don't use it up. It exists in processes, cyclical processes, that mankind can increasingly manage, improve, and develop, and expand. We can create the cycles needed to provide the fresh water supplies, the fresh water systems where they're needed, to provide for the needs of mankind. We can do that. And what we're going to discuss here tonight is the higher perspective that we need to drive towards, which will enable the greatest leaps in mankind's management of the global water system. So if we can have the first video displayed on the screen here, we see a very nicely done animation produced by NASA on the global moisture system. What you're seeing is the flows of moisture over the oceans, over the land, in a just generic fashion that occurs all the time. Here we zoom in on the particular interaction we're concerned about here, the interaction of the Pacific Ocean with the western half of the North American continent. And as you can see, as it runs through one more time, there's an immense amount of water flowing throughout the whole system. This atmospheric moisture patterns, which is really the source of all water supplies on land that people normally think of. When people think of water supplies, they think of rivers, lakes, snowpack, groundwater, etc. But all of these things that people think of as the water supplies is really an effect generated by these atmospheric moisture flows. That the source depositing all the water on the land that we utilize, that we develop, that we depend upon, are these flows of atmospheric moisture. That this is the source of what people traditionally think of as the fresh water supplies. But what we're going to discuss here tonight is that the mankind does not have to depend solely upon the water that's been deposited on the land. That we can go to this higher level of these atmospheric systems But to do that, we have to understand that what we just saw there in that animation, what we talk about when we're referencing atmospheric water systems, is really a shadow. It's an effect of certain forces, certain processes. That what we experience in terms of the atmospheric system of moisture flows is really a shadow, an effect of larger processes. And it's mankind uncovering and understanding those larger processes, which will give us new tools for understanding how to manage the effects, the shadows that we experience with the atmospheric moisture system. So now if we go to the first graphic, the first still image, we see a relatively basic depiction of the global water cycle. And as I just referenced, you see the evaporation of ocean water, most of which never makes it on land, but that which does make it on land, you can see that kind of upper curve stretching from the flow from the oceans over the continents. That is the source of all water on land that we tend to deal with, that we utilize, that we have to work with under the existing or old conception of just managing the surface water flows, what gets deposited. But that process, as you see indicated in this graphic, that process of atmospheric transfer of moisture from the oceans to the land, the source of all of our water supplies that we depend upon and utilize, is driven by cosmic factors, is driven and managed and modulated by activities that don't come from the earth, that aren't determined by the earth, that aren't affected by the earth, but come from outside the earth system. You have on the one end, solar activity drives the entire process. The evaporation of all the ocean water that becomes the source of all the fresh water in the cycle is done by solar activity. The sun is evaporating immense amount of ocean water, desalinating it, purifying it, populating the air, filling the atmosphere with this atmospheric moisture, which then is the source of the water cycles over land. So that's driven by solar activity. That drives the whole process. That's not an earth-based process. That's driven by the activity of the sun, the solar system. So you have the whole cycle starting, being initiated and created by this cosmic effect, this solar driver. On the other side, you have the activity of the galaxy more generally, which is constantly at play. We right now, as you're watching this, as I'm speaking to you here, we are being bombarded by the effects of radiation from the galaxy generally. It fills the entire atmosphere. It's a constant input determining certain conditions, certain qualities of the atmosphere as a whole. And it's these qualities which are affected by this galactic factor, galactic radiation, which play a major role in affecting when atmospheric moisture condenses from a vapor form to a liquid form and precipitates. So again, a cosmic effect constantly coming in, a regular input into the system, playing a critical role in determining the general water cycle that we experience, that we think of, which is really a shadow of the effects of these cosmic processes. So on the one side, in the initiation, you have this solar driver pumping the whole atmosphere full of fresh water. On the other end, you have this galactic cosmic radiation input affecting the conditions which facilitate when that water falls out of the sky, where it does so, when it does so, etc. So we're dealing with, when we're talking about the water system, we are dealing with not an earth-based process. We're dealing with a process which reflects and expresses these inputs from the sun and from beyond the sun, from the galactic system. So with that stated, with that as our baseline, we have to pose the question, what happens when these cosmic factors change, when they vary, when they fluctuate. If our climate, if our water system, our water cycle, is an expression of these cosmic effects, you know, if the water system of the earth is an expression of this subsuming activity of the sun organizing the solar system as a whole, what happens when the sun changes? Well, we pull up the second video just to kind of illustrate what types of variations we know the sun goes through. We have a footage of the sun. We probably want to loop this through once or twice. It's a very short video. But we have footage of the sun from 2010 and 2014 side by side. And you can see right there, there's a significant variation in the amount of activity going on in the sun. 2014, there's just generally more activity, more spots that reflect sunspots, magnetic fluxes, variations in activity on the surface of the sun going on in 2014. You know, this is just to kind of give you an image that the sun is not just sitting there, you know, doing the same thing all the time. It's changing what it does. It cycles every decade. The entire magnetic field of the sun flips every 11 years, which is an incredible feat given the size of the sun. I mean, this thing is massive, and it goes through a pole reversal every 11 years. The magnetic field completely flips. I mean, this is an active body going through all kinds of changes. You know, as these 11-year cycles go through, the sun varies in its activity. Most significant for the effect we're talking about here is it varies in its magnetic effects. The magnetic field created by the sun, which kind of plays a very significant role in modulating the interaction between the radiation coming from the galaxy into the solar system and what the sun is doing. That this is a factor that's constantly in flux and changing as the sun goes through these cycles. What you saw in that video clip is largely an expression of the changing magnetic activity, the magnetic field of the sun. So if we go to the second graphic, we have here one depiction of a study showing what types of things happen to our climate system, our water cycle, when the sun goes through variations and changes. Now, this is on a time scale of about the past 1,000 years. And this is looking at the variations in precipitation on the Tibet Plateau in China. And they were able to measure the variations in the sizes of tree rings in some very old trees up there, which allowed them to get a sense of how the precipitation, the water flow up there, changed over this past 1,000-year time period. And what they saw in this study was that the amount of water, the amount of precipitation in this particular region varied, it fluctuated. But it fluctuated in direct correspondence with records for how the sun changed, how the sun fluctuated. These so-called minimums indicated here on the graphic are periods that we've already documented as extremely low solar activity. The Dalton minimum, the Maunder minimum, some people might have heard of. The Sporer minimum, the Wolf minimum. These were periods that, based on other records, we have indications that in these times the sun got very inactive, very quiet, very relaxed. You know, maybe it took a breather or something. It took some time off. And what we see in these records in the Tibet Plateau is that when the sun got weaker, in direct correspondence with that, we saw changes in precipitation in the water cycle, how the water cycle operated. Now, that shouldn't be a surprise, right? The sun is driving the whole process, right? The sun is the bulk input into driving the whole climate system on Earth. So when we see solar variation, it shouldn't be a surprise that we see changes in climate and in precipitation and in the water cycle. If we go to the next still image, the third graphic, I just compiled here a quick depiction of other locations where similar studies have been done. Now, obviously, I'm not going to go through all of these for the sake of time here. But in every one of those locations indicated on the map, that's another location where we see records of climate and activity of the water cycle in particular, changing and varying in correspondence with changes in solar activity. So this is not even just some, one isolated study in one remote part of the world. This is all over the world. Some regions tend to get colder, some regions tend to get drier, some regions even tend to get wetter when the sun becomes less active. And that's just a sampling of a larger array of studies that indicate this. I've just selected for illustrative purposes here. So the point is, recognizing this solar effect, the role of the sun as the organizing force in the solar system, governing and driving the hydrological cycle, the water cycle on Earth, we now see indications for how, when the sun goes through cyclical variations and changes, we see corresponding effects back here on Earth. Now, on the one hand, again, you have the change in the amount of energy output by the sun itself. But also, what I just referenced a few minutes ago, you have actually larger changes in the strength of the sun's magnetic field, its kind of governing influence on the solar system. So as the sun gets weaker, the strength of its surrounding sphere of influence gets weaker and allows a greater effect from interstellar space, from the galaxy more generally, to come in and influence systems here on Earth, including the water cycle and the climate system. So these are kind of two ways the sun acts as a direct input into the system, but then also into the water system, then also as a modulating factor governing and affecting the role of the galactic input into the water system, which again, as I referenced in the beginning, is a critical factor determining how and when the water that's in the atmosphere reaches the right conditions when it can change into a liquid state and precipitate and fall out of the atmosphere, kind of closing the other end of the atmospheric cycle. So you have this cosmic kind of boundary conditions on both sides of this atmospheric expression, this atmospheric shadow in water of these cosmic effects. So that's an indication of the role of the sun itself. But we also have a larger scale to look at too. We have the fact that our solar system itself experiences different regions of the galaxy through its motions through the galactic system. That our solar system is actually orbiting through our galactic system and experiencing very different environments. The solar system is moving into and out of large regions of dense clouds of gas and dust. It's moving into and out of these spiral arms of our galaxy. It's moving above and below the disk, the plane of our galactic system. So it's doing all kinds of stuff, and it's experiencing different environments as it does so. And these have different cosmic radiation effects on the solar system and on our Earth and on our Earth's climate, on our atmospheric system. If we go to the third video, we have one depiction of just one of these motions kind of separated out. Just a very simplistic illustration of the motion of our solar system above and then now moving below and then heading towards back above the plane of our galaxy. So our galaxy is a disk-like structure, relatively thin compared to its overall size. And what we know is that the solar system tends to move above and below this galactic disk as it travels through the galaxy. And now recent records have indicated that again, the climate system on Earth changes in correspondence to these different galactic environments. When we're above or below the galactic plane, we tend to get cooler climates, or warmer climates, I'm sorry. We tend to get warmer global climate environments when we're above or below the galactic plane. When we're crossing through the middle of the galactic plane, we tend to get cooler environments. The Earth's climate system, the Earth's hydrological system as well, responds to these different galactic environments, again, because as we stated at the beginning, the hydrological system, the water system, and the climate system more generally is an expression of these cosmic factors. So we know that when we move above and below the galactic plane, we see indications that the Earth's climate system cools and warms and changes in correspondence to that. If we go to the fourth video, we see one other illustration of this, which is the motion of our solar system kind of orbiting around the galaxy, moving into and out of our galaxy's spiral arms. Now, unfortunately, I believe this animation was done backwards, so I apologize to the few of you who recognize that. But this is a general depiction of how our solar system, if you played it backwards, or how our solar system moves into and out of these spiral arm structures of our galaxy. So again, different galactic environments our whole solar system is experiencing. Now, if we go to the fourth graphic, the fourth still image, we see that as we move into and out of, actually it should be a different graphic if we have it there. As we move into and out of the different spiral arms of the galaxy, we see dramatic changes again in the climate and the temperature. And this is something that's been documented for the past decade or more, that as our solar systems moved into these spiral arm structures, you tend to get major cooling events, major climate changes. Not even ice ages, but what are sometimes referred to as global ice house events, where it's not just a little bit of glaciation occurring. Much of the planet can be covered in ice, in glaciers. Huge events. So again, these correspond directly, again, to the motions of our solar system through the galactic system, through the spiral arms in particular. So, as was stated, we have the water system, and particularly this atmospheric component of the water system, which is the source of all water we have on land that we depend upon and deal with and manage up until this point, as being influenced and driven by these cosmic factors, this changes in solar activity, changes in the relationship of the solar system to the galaxy, that our water system, our atmospheric water system, our water cycle is an expression of these larger cosmic processes. And so when these cosmic processes change and vary, we see corresponding changes and fluctuations. Now again, I'll just make a kind of necessary note. Apparently this is a major surprise to people like Jerry Brown, that the climate apparently changes. This, I guess they never took middle school geology or geological history classes. But yes, it's true. The climate on Earth changes. The climate of the solar system changes. The climate of the galaxy changes. If you choose to eat beef or not, or if you choose to drive an SUV, has nothing to do with that. But the climate does change, and we are affected by these climate changes as California is now experiencing, largely as an effect of these larger processes. So the point is, we're now at the point where we're beginning to recognize this. The science is coming in, the studies are coming in. We're starting to get a better realization of these cosmic effects, these cosmic driving forces in our water system, in our climate system. That it's not an Earth, that the water cycle that we depend upon The water cycle that we need to improve and manage for the future of mankind is not an Earth-based process. It doesn't come from the Earth. It's not driven by the Earth. It's not modulated by what the Earth does. There are processes on Earth that have effects. Sure, life has effects. Geological activity has effects. Those are there. But what we're beginning to realize is that the large driving factors, as we just went through, governing global ice ages and global warming, governing variations in weather patterns and precipitation and drought in flood regions, is associated with these larger scale solar and related galactic effects, which drive this atmospheric component of the water system, which again is more of a shadow and expression of these larger forces. So we're beginning to realize this. We're beginning to realize that we live in a cosmic environment. We're dependent upon the activity of an environment driven by cosmic processes, solar and galactic processes. But the point of all this is not that we now sit back and say, okay, that's what it is. The point is that we as mankind then utilize this new knowledge, these new insights, to enable us to improve our ability to manage that system. That's what this is telling us right now with respect to the crisis in California, in terms of addressing the water needs in California, but throughout the Southwest and throughout the world more broadly. What we're looking at is the perspective on a higher order understanding of what the system is that we're actually dealing with, that we're actually dependent upon, and then utilizing that higher understanding to change how we can interact with it, to manage it in completely new ways. And just as a last image, I have the fifth graphic here, which is it's a simple schematic of some of the technologies that are being developed, which just begin to open the door to how mankind can start to tap in to these processes. This is a schematic for a so-called artificial ionization system of the technology developed in Russia in the 1980s and utilized for over a decade successfully in Mexico, referred to as the ELAT technology, standing for electrification of the atmosphere. And through these ionization systems, we've already demonstrated for years now that mankind can actually manage and modulate these electrical and ionization conditions of the atmospheric system, which are the conditions that play a major role in determining how the atmospheric components of the water cycle operate. In layman's terms, we've used these systems to increase rainfall, to increase precipitation, even to inhibit rainfall where we didn't want it. This stuff has been done. It's being done right now. There's more trials going on. This is just kind of a beginning development of a whole perspective of managing these atmospheric conditions of the water cycle to our benefit, to ensure that the water goes where it's needed, to ensure that the water doesn't go where it's not needed, to take a higher order control on the water system to provide the water needs for mankind. So again, this is one technology, but it's a technology that comes under this broader perspective of mankind acting and operating on the scale of the solar system, really, is what we're talking about. We're talking about mankind moving to the level, not physically, not biologically, moving, more important than that, moving conceptually, mentally, creatively, to the level of the solar system, understanding the Earth is subsumed by that, and acting on the Earth systems from the standpoint of acting on the level of the solar system as a whole, and reaching beyond that, starting to look to the galactic system, that mankind can change his actions on Earth to be in coherence with mankind's unique ability to understand the solar system, the galaxy, and how these systems subsume and determine what happens on Earth. and mankind can act on Earth in a unique way, informed by these understandings. And the effect of that will be, if we're to do it, no water crisis. We can manage the water crisis if we go to this perspective, if we go to this level. And so, to round this off for my component of the discussion here, I just think there's a dramatic irony in this situation we're looking at, because what we're just discussing, what I'm putting on the table here is work that's going on. These are studies that are ongoing. This is research that is happening that points in a very important and profound direction, that mankind can move to this higher level, and that we can manage all of our water crises from this higher level and deal with them by going to this, level of the solar system, so to speak. And that's something unique to mankind. That's what mankind can do specifically. This is a new expression of the power of mankind as a uniquely creative species, different than any animal species on this planet. And with that being the case, this now being demonstrated and developed, and we're starting to get a taste of this potential direction and a greater understanding of what mankind even is on this planet as a creative force that can reach beyond the planet. In this context, you get Jerry Brown. You get these idiots who are running around saying, in this context, we're just discussing this, and then what's Jerry Brown now saying? Well, we reached the limit to growth. We realize we reached the limit. That's as much as we can do. We ran out of water. What are you going to do? We're just going to kill some people now. I mean, what morons, right? We're looking at the perspective of mankind completely moving to a new level of his understanding of what this water system even is we're dealing with. And then you get these complete idiots out there saying, this is the limit to growth. We can't keep growing. Mankind's run into his boundary conditions. That's it. We can't go any farther. I mean, it would be laughable if it wasn't so criminal. If people's lives weren't dependent upon whether we let Jerry Brown continue his genocide policy or not. But this is idiocy. The guy thinks we've run out of water. The whole planet's covered in water. There's water everywhere. We ran out of smart people, like his father, who knew how to manage it. And we were left with a bunch of idiots like Jerry Brown who bought into this crazy 68er depopulation ideology, who are being run by people that want to depopulate the planet. So we didn't run out of water. We're on the verge of a completely new perspective of mankind's relationship to water. But what we need to do is get rid of the idiots holding us back and getting in our way. And I think that's what Michael's going to get into. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Ben. Just by means of introduction, our next guest tonight is Michael Steger, who is a leading member of the LaRouche PAC Policy Committee, as viewers of this website know, participates on a weekly basis in the discussion that we have with Mr. LaRouche on Mondays, is a former candidate for United States Congress, and is currently leading the fight on the ground in California. So, Michael, let me hand it over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So what Ben just presented was really a foundation and a basis for a revolution in economic policy for this nation and for the world. And because of the dire crisis we're facing in California, which is not simply the drought, but the drought is compounding what is the breakdown of the U.S. economy over the last 4 or 5 decades. Now, in that context, we took Ben's proposal to address the water crisis, which is not only a technology such as nuclear desalination or ionization, but it is a fundamental shift in how we think of ourselves in the universe and in the solar system. And we took that proposal, we took it to Sacramento, thinking there might be some living souls there willing to consider policies to address the crisis the state now faces. And this is a real crisis. This is a crisis for 38 million people, many of whom are barely at this point surviving. And I think that has to be a point made, because the vulnerability of the U.S. population today cannot tolerate this kind of stupidity and incompetence from Brown and the other people, associated with this policy, which includes the Bush family. And when we brought this policy to Sacramento, it was considered criminal. It was considered a crime to even discuss the idea that the water crisis could be solved, that there was indeed no water crisis, that you could indeed bring water into the areas of California through the technology, through the policies, and through the research Ben just laid out and presented, as he has in his papers and in the ongoing discussion. Now that tells you the kind of fascism that's taking place in Sacramento, and it is not the first time that we've been told they are not interested in increasing water supply in California. They are interested in conserving water. Now that brings to the point of Brown and the fascist policy in Sacramento, because this is not about conservation. This is not about, we're all in this together at public conservation. You go back to April 1st, when Jerry Brown, and now there's signs all over California, for those of you who haven't made it out here yet. Brown is the new green. Now, Jerry Brown gets up on April 1st and says, I'm enforcing law of a 25% mandatory cut in water. That was going to be mitigated by water agencies with a for-profit motive. So already the idea of public conservation is really just a facade covering up the fact of privatization of the water supply of the state. Now we've had that happen in California before. It was with the public utility of electricity. It was called the Enron disaster. And it was explicitly targeting the most vulnerable population in California for record so-called financial profits while killing the population. And that is fascism. That is what Lyndon LaRouche identified in a debate in 1971 as the fascist policies of people like Milton Friedman, the people like Henry Kissinger, the people like George Shultz. And George Shultz in California plays a factor in this policy. So you've got this policy now of pushing water conservation. Now the reality is 25% across the board is not accurate. And they're trying to say that, well, we're going to reduce the water of the more affluent areas more than the more impoverished areas. We're going to not cut the farmers. We're going to let the farmers have water, supposedly, and cut just the population. And you see the media is painting a hysteria. The media like the New York Times, which is pushing this no-growth policy. It's the same policy you saw from the rabid neocons, that once the fall of the Soviet Union happened, history had come to an end, human development and social advancement had ended. It's not the case. It's pushed by this fascist policy, by this grouping. The water agencies are now going to be cutting water in different places. But what you find is that where they're cutting, they have no sense of what's happening on the ground, or maybe they do. And you have letters written from civil bureaucrats, city employees, people representing certain of the most vulnerable demographics in the state, places like Compton, places like the Central Valley of Fresno or Bakersfield. And what they're saying, what they're painting a very clear picture of, is that a 20% cut in water to people who are already having a hard time paying for rent, or for food, or for medical bills, for people who are already not watering their lawns. The so-called, these political terms today, the low-hanging fruit. The low-hanging fruit are people like Jerry Brown. The so-called green grasses and ornamental landscaping. But places like Compton, places throughout the impoverished cities of California that are not part of the real estate bubble, not part of this internet bubble, this Wall Street fraud of an economy, are not spending huge amounts of water on these areas. They're limiting their usage of these public utilities towards basic needs and requirements. And that's a hell of a lot more than the 5 gallons that some of these people in the Nestle company or other privatized water companies want to allocate to the population. So when you give a 20% cut to people that are already this vulnerable. You're not forcing them, you're not nudging their behavior towards a little bit less water for their lawns or washing their new car. You're saying you're going to bathe less. You're going to be involved in a less sanitary, in an area which is going to have the propagation of more disease. You're going to be given a clear message: you're not wanted. And the prices of water are going to be increasing under this regimen until the population is eradicated. Because as Jerry Brown referenced, California only supported 400,000 people for a very long time. And if that's the case, Jerry, well, you should start with yourself, and we can get on with developing the water resources of our state and of our nation. So this is the fascist policy which is laid out in California. The same is true for the farmers. If for 3 years farmers have already been cut, the water supply has already been cut. The state program is allocating a very small percentage. The federal program built by Franklin Roosevelt has been allocating 0 now for 2 years, or will be. So the farmers have already taken major measures. And the farmers produce something which is not a new app for your smartphone. It is not an inflated price of real estate. They're producing the food and the nutrition for not only California, the nation, but also globally. So you have this media hysteria pitting these two groups against each other. And even the farm leaders in the state have said, when we meet with the governor, we have the farm groups, then you have the environmental groups. You don't have people representing areas of the urban population, the poor parts of California. They aren't at the table. Are they concerned about the farmers using water for food? I don't think they're concerned about farmers using water for food. I think they'd like to make sure the farmers have enough water to produce enough food so that there's enough for them, that the prices are within their budget, that they can afford to feed their families. That's probably what's going to be their concern, not what the environmentalists are putting out as a concern. And there is no concern for the Delta smelt. There is no concern for environmental concerns. These environmentalists have done more to pollute the environment than any other part of the U.S. population. They are the ones destroying the environment, hands down. They're the ones polluting the oceans because they've restricted the science and the technology to deal with the actual reality that it's good for mankind to develop, it's good for populations to grow, and you need to sustain and develop that technology to make that possible. So we should get rid of the environmentalists if we want to clean up the environment. And we should start with Jerry Brown. Now, what Jerry Brown has done then with this policy, this so-called water conservation, this cloak of public conversation, which is really the privatization of water, is a crime. It's a crime to the state constitution, where water itself is part of the general welfare of the state because of the arid condition of the state, which is partly what makes it such a good growing area. They've made this part of the state constitution. And on this basis alone, Jerry Brown is criminal, and his remaining in office is a crime. This is a fascist program. It is Hitler-like policies. You have an economic problem, reduce the population, and target the most vulnerable. And the people who are targeted, we've had a squad of 4 individuals and organizers in the Central Valley the last few days. The people who are targeted by these policies for their livelihood, for their contribution to the nation and their society, know what's happening, that this is existential and it is life or death. And the point now is not just to leave it there, but to recognize the actions that must be taken. Brown must go out of office, in jail, prosecuted, along with people like Dennis O'Connor and the rabid ideologues of Sacramento. And that what Ben just laid out must become the policy for the state and for the nation. Now, the bigger question is where this came from. Because this is not just happening in California. But California has been a test case, not only under the Brown program of water, but you look at the program we've had now 4 years of Jerry Brown's policies, added on to the 8 years of his policies in the 1960s and 70s, which is what shut down the nuclear power program, not just in California, but across the country. That same nuclear power which could be providing desalination capabilities today. But you also had Schwarzenegger for 7 years. And you had the Enron program for 3 years before that. A direct policy of George Shultz. A direct policy of the fascists who put in Pinochet into Chile. The same type of fascism that you see promoted by Obama today in the Ukraine, the same kind of Nazis that Obama's promoting in the Ukraine are now dominating and have been dominating Sacramento policy for up to 15 years. And it's not the Republicans who are going to solve the problem because they bought this hook, line, and sinker with Bush and Cheney and with Schwarzenegger. And what we have to do today then is to define a new American presidency, independent of both this Republican grouping who are out to kill us, clearly, and this rabid environmentalist pro-drug policy like Schultz, like Brown, who clearly have a depopulation agenda. This is the criminality that has been tolerated by the American people for far too long. And it is happening in the United States. It's happening in California as a test case. It's the same policy you see in the Ukraine, and it's the same policy you see in Greece today. And this is what the BRICS nations, this is what Ben has presented as a scientific orientation of development and technology represent. And that's what these BRICS nations are responding to, this kind of fascist economic program that was warned about by Mr. LaRouche in the 1960s and 70s. And either we fight today to end it, or we're not going to exist much longer. And that is very clear in the case of California and its people. So I appreciate the time, and back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for joining us tonight. So I think, as Michael said, what's been made very clear tonight is that we do have the program that will form the basis of a new American presidency, a new presidency which LaRouche PAC is committed to spearheading and putting together. And I think also what's been made very clear tonight is that the lies that are being spouted by Jerry Brown and his fellow brown shirts, you could call them, are not just a fallacy, but a malicious fallacy, which are based on an oligarchical commitment to the reduction of the human population on this planet. This criminal negligence of scientific fact, the scientific fact which was presented in very clear terms by Ben this evening, disqualifies Jerry Brown and anyone who agrees with him from holding public office, especially under the current conditions under which this policy threatens the lives of the most vulnerable first, but progressively more, the large portion of the population of the state of California, the country, this country, the United States, and the planet as a whole. So we will develop much more on this on the LaRouche PAC website in the coming days. We will be engaged in a follow-up conversation on Monday with Mr. LaRouche and the policy committee as a whole, which Michael Steger will be participating on. And we will be back here at 8 o'clock next week, Friday night, for our next webcast. So please stay tuned to LaRouchePAC.com. We thank you for joining us here tonight. I'd like to thank Ben Deniston for joining me here in the studio, and I'd like to thank Michael Steger for joining us over video from California. Thank you very much, and good night.